Well, today we just have this, I don't even know, I'm just speechless. I cannot believe I've got both Jim Stephenson Jr. here and Morley Robbins, two geniuses on the topic of hormone D and its effects on our health. And today we're going to start talking about just kind of an overview of vitamin D. We'll talk about specific things, specific issues with it, and then we'll transition into talking about how vitamin D affects vitamin A, because that's something people really need to know about, and we don't know. So, oh my goodness, I can't believe I have you both here. I'm just so grateful for both of you. I'm a huge fan of both of your works. You do so much research and spend so much time anyways, I'm very grateful for you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely.
So let's just dive right in. Jim,
Okay.
Before we started talking, you talked about like two main points that you feel like are really important to get across. So what's the problem with vitamin D?
The problem with vitamin D is that they use the 25D as the way of demonstrating a deficiency. And they do that by doing a blood test of 25D, which only assesses a couple of the unique forms of 25D. In my research, I've found 15 different unique forms of 25D. And at most, some tests test 3 of those forms. Most of them only test 2. And nowadays, because most people aren't getting much vitamin D2 in their diet, they're only testing the D3 faction of the 25D. Plus, they're only looking at the serum level. So what's in your blood, which is what your body has decided to allow in blood from the liver, which is the one that activates it. And I use the analogy, that's like obsessing over the fuel line in your car. And you have to think about, is the car running? Number one, does your body want vitamin D to activate to the active form? Because 25D doesn't do anything. It's a storage substrate that's inactive. And if the car is running, is it idling in the yard? Is it driving, in a school zone, or are you on the Autobahn? There's big differences there. So how much is going to be in your serum is determined by the body in the first place. It's not a storage location. It's sold as a storage location, but it's not. Vitamin D is a fat soluble molecule. Basic biology tells you fat solubles are stored in the body. Serum is not storage. After all, when you get food sources of vitamin D, you're not drinking salmon blood. You're eating a salmon fillet. In essence, you're eating its muscle. Muscle is a major storage spot for us in our body. So it's a marker. It's a proxy for checking vitamin D, but you're to also assume that means you're low in the active form, and no one is testing the active form. So that's a major problem.
Before you get to that point, and that's a very important one about not testing for the active, I just want to highlight what you're saying about it showing up in the blood and it's not in storage in the liver. A very subtle issue that the cardiologists don't seem to understand is what's the precursor to vitamin D? Well, it's cholesterol. We know that. And so I would always challenge audiences with a riddle. What's the nation with the highest cholesterol but has the lowest storage D? And people are always bollocks by that, and they got real flummoxed. And what most people don't realize is that cholesterol is also meant to be stored in the liver, because you got to use it, you got to metabolize it to make hormones, right?
Right.
And when the liver is under stress, guess what it does to cholesterol? Sends it out into the serum. And when serum cholesterol starts to rise, you got a serious problem.
Right.
Here, what are they trying to do? They're trying to increase the serum level of this storage protein, which on the face of it makes no sense. It's physiological insanity. So I just wanted to reinforce the point. People don't realize what the whole psychodrama with cholesterol was. And what they never told us was that when you start adding iron filings, 1941, increase in 50% in 1969, what did that do? It stressed the liver, which caused cholesterol production and then cholesterol release into the bloodstream. It's absolutely.
Well, not to mention the fact that healing molecules are shuttled with cholesterol.
Yes.
So you're trying to heal yourself with cholesterol. And one thing about vitamin D, when you make your vitamin D, the substrate, the actual technical substrate to make the D3 is a specific type of cholesterol. It's 7-dehydrocholesterol.
Right.
And that makes vitamin D and what we typically refer to as cholesterol. Cholesterol is a vast world. There's LDL, there's HDL, there's a bunch of them. But when you take vitamin D3 instead of making it, you leave more 7-dehydrocholesterol substrate there to become cholesterol, number one. Plus, you also then force your body to shuttle the oral D3 with LDL cholesterol as well.
Wow.
Wow.
That's a huge factoid, what you just shared.
Right. Yeah.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah, it's the lymphatic system that picks up the D3, oral D3, and shuttles it specifically with LDL cholesterol on its first journey to the liver.
Okay, I'm going to ask a very embarrassing question. People probably think, well, you should know this more. Where does the lymphatic system and the circulatory system intersect?
They're actually two different
Oh, I know that.
systems in the biology that I was trained. What the lymphatic is a slow circulatory system, much like the blood system, the lymph system.
But they must intersect at some point.
Yeah, and that's very technical, and I couldn't
Okay.
capture that. That's for sure.
So there's a whole new topic, Stephanie, that we can explore in a future meeting. Is the
Right.
intersection of lymph and blood, because I'm sure there is what I do know is that when lymph and blood slow down, they have too much iron and too little copper. That's a fact.
Right.
But I digress. Back
Okay.
to the story, Jim. And for the listeners, people need to understand that Jim is here celebrating his birthday.
Yeah.
He can't stand not telling the truth on his birthday. That's his
No,
greatest celebration.
this is a gift to myself, sharing this stuff.
Well, so I just want to kind of back up for the listener who, when we're saying 25-dehydroxy, that's if you go to your doctor's office today and you say, I want my vitamin D measured, that's what they're going to measure. And that is
Yes.
storage form. And you're saying that this is a terrible assessment of your vitamin D because you're looking at the serum level, and vitamin D should not be in your serum. It should be, you're storing it. You mentioned you store a lot in muscle.
Right.
Not accurate. And it's not indicative of your active form, which is
Right.
1,25 dehydroxy.
Exactly.
Okay. Just for Tracy out in Wisconsin.
Okay. And I'll mention a little bit about that. So the 25D is stored in the liver, but vitamin D in general is stored in a lot of places. It's stored in bone, it's stored in muscle, it's stored in the kidneys, it's stored in fat. And so that's the 25D. The thing is like I said, there's several different forms of 25D, and some of them in the other pathways don't influence calcium. So your body may actually be making a decision to make a form of 25D that isn't calcium influencing. And that's pretty important. So healthy people could use a 25D test as just a normal assessment of their health. But once you have a comorbid condition, it's not a very good marker for two very specific reasons. 25D is a negative acute phase reactant, and so is its carrier protein, vitamin D binding protein. So once you have an insult, they aren't good markers anymore.
Why is that, Jim? What does that mean? Negative? Make sure
They just react to the inflammation and the body's insult of illness, and there's less of them available. That's just the class of molecule they are, negative acute phase reactants.
So you're saying that if somebody was, so instead of potentially low storage D causing illness, low storage D could be a result of illness.
Yeah, they even label it a marker. It's a marker for illness. And a lot of papers actually use that language. If you do research, you can search for 25D plus the word marker and word illness, and you'll run across lots of research on that.
And let me put my spin on that, because I think that's a very important point as well, is that inflammation, it's a term that everyone talks about, but
Right.
they don't really understand what it is.
Right.
Inflammation means that the mitochondria are not making energy efficiently.
Right.
And hydrogen peroxide is being created, not water molecules. That's a big deal. And William Weglicki, who's a very gifted cardiologist, actually trained at a little school in Boston called Harvard until they kicked him out because he kept talking about magnesium causing cardiac inflammation, magnesium deficiency.
Right.
And he wrote a very important article in 1992 with a number of his colleagues, where he was able to prove that magnesium deficiency, which is magnesium gets lost to oxidative stress. And when the magnesium deficiency reaches a threshold, then we have what's called inflammation.
Right.
Very, very important. And why is that important for storage D? Because the enzyme to make storage D in the liver requires magnesium.
Right.
The other metal that can be found in the liver, especially in copper deficient people, is a rising level of iron. Iron will store in the liver. And so the iron will cause oxidative stress, which will affect the magnesium status, which then affects the production of the function of the enzyme to produce the storage D. And all of these factors are all related. It's all under this umbrella of inflammation. And inflammation is not a disease, it's a state of energy inefficiency. That's really what it is.
Right.
So it's important for people to realize why, on a metabolic basis, the liver is not able to make this storage vitamin D, because there's mineral dysregulation taking place.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Magnesium is needed for every step of activation for vitamin D in the body.
Right.
And
even that transport, the binding protein that you mentioned a minute ago, that's
right.
magnesium dependent.
Oh, I'm sure it would be. Yeah, that makes sense.
No, it is. it's a fact. I mean, that's the work of Dr. Deng. I mean, there's like 7 or 8 places in vitamin D metabolism that require magnesium. That's
right.
Pretty important.
And right here, let's see if I can share the screen. I did load up the graphic of where magnesium is needed for vitamin D. Right. And let's see if this works. It says it's disabled for me to share right now.
Goodness, let me
Sorry.
that. If I click on your name.
And he can be the presenter.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Ooh, I'm going to be the presenter now.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Jim
this one here.
Jim is the birthday boy. He's the host.
Is that showing up for you?
Yeah.
Yes, it's beautiful.
Okay. Awesome. So that is where magnesium is needed, everywhere where there's the little, and I've got 2 screens. Some of it's hidden by my laptop, but the circular pink looking MG circled there are where it's needed for the activation.
And Stephanie, what I'd like to do is nominate Jim as Magnesium Man so that I can transcend into being Copper Man.
Awesome.
You're gonna have to be both of them. I don't know enough about magnesium. I'm gonna stop the share right here so that my screen looks like I expect again, so I don't get confused. Okay. So there we go.
All right, awesome.
Yeah,
that's a real important slide, folks.
Yeah, it is.
Take a minute.
I think I got it from you.
Yeah, well, that's okay, but go back. I would encourage the listeners to go back and study that slide. And I think that's from Deng 2013. It's a major study from NIH of
okay.
all
And one other thing about inflammation, actually, I almost forgot this, and I may want to share the screen again, is that the paper that you talk about by Amar, no benefit in being over 21 in vitamin D. And that matters. That matters because it's the inflammatory markers that start to rise. That's what his data set showed. And
Yes.
let me see if I have this right here that I wanted to share. So those are the lower papers there. If you see no benefit above 21, they use those data sets in 3 different papers. There's the paper numbers right there.
Yep.
And the top one is just a resource about the all-cause mortality curves that show that being high and low are both harmful when it comes to vitamin D.
Right.
And that the lowest mortality lies between 20 and 24
Yes.
in G. So you couple that with no benefit over 21, and you see that the IOM really nailed it when they said 20 is a great number for a target.
Right. Yeah. And see that what's happened in society is, Stephanie, you mentioned Michael Hollick at Boston University. He redefined the range
Right.
for D. It used to be like, I think it was like from 10 to 25 or something like that. And he increased it from 30 to 100.
Right.
So that
Right.
everyone on the planet is low. Well, it's like, wait a minute, we've just redefined and reconfigured this whole thing. And when we use the phrase low vitamin D, it has to have the right context. Are we
Right.
talking context of Mohammed Amer at Hopkins? Or are we talking about the farcical range that was created by Michael Hollick at Boston University? People need to know that there's 2 completely different worlds, and that if you don't have the right context, you can't interpret data.
Right. And we talked about Hollick before we started this podcast, and he's important in history. He discovered 25D and 125D with what I call the godfather of vitamin D,
Yes.
which was Hector De Luca. And the thing that's really relevant about that is that when you have people writing papers in a peer review process, if you get with a cluster of folks who agree with you and you peer review each other's work, you're able to prop up stuff that isn't even necessarily true. And so this paper that I want to share right now, it's either by Amy Prohl or it's by Meg Mangan. And Meg made the 20 to 24 paper, the inflammation connection that we talk about all the time, infection connection, that
24.
talks about the 20 to 24 being the lowest all-cause mortality. But let's look at what we call the consensus on vitamin D and see who you see right in the center there with the most citations, Michael Hollick with 58 of them. So this is the roundabout citation of one another that is able to then say the agreed upon marker for vitamin D is 25D. And so they all say it repeatedly. They all cite each other's work, and that becomes fact, even though it's really not.
So this becomes self-fulfilling prophecy.
Wow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Beautiful. That's great.
That is so, Jim, I shared this with Morley on a previous podcast, but one of the issues that I ran into in graduate school was we were only allowed to use research whenever we wrote a paper or did a presentation that was 7 years old or younger.
Yeah.
Okay.
And when you're 20 years old or 21, like you don't question that. I didn't anyways.
Right.
Doing what I was told. But that always stuck in my mind as like, that's weird because they make it sound like older research is bad research or not valid research.
Not relevant research.
Not relevant research.
That is a shame because funding of research alone brings that into question. Some of the older documents or studies, they radio labeled the vitamin D to see where it went, how it was liberated. They don't do any of that anymore. And a lot of molecules that I am familiar with aren't written about anymore. There's nobody getting paid to study what they consider an inert molecule of vitamin D discovered in the 70s.
Well, and the thing about Michael Hollick's work, a lot of that is around like 2010 or so, which was the time that I was in school. And so like, just because of my age, I have a natural bias towards his work.
Right.
So it's just interesting, just an interesting observation.
Let me make a segue off that observation. So when they talk about vitamin D, 2,5-D being the recognized health marker for your vitamin D status, there's usually a citation there. Most people don't follow that citation, okay? That citation will be to a very old paper, older than 7 years, undoubtedly. So the other day, somebody shared a 2022 paper with me, and the citations in it were from 2006, the ones about these people being deficient and why you need to measure 25D to prove that deficiency. Well, there's a huge disconnect there, because a 2006 cited paper was back when the RDA was either 200 or 400, and the goal was not 30. So most of the people the 2022 paper is labeling deficient weren't even deficient under the standard that is cited, using as a citation.
Wow. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Quite the labyrinth.
It is a labyrinth.
And are you gonna share that bell-shaped curve, Jim?
Yes, you want to do that now?
Yeah, I think that's
Okay, we might as well talk about.
what I want the listeners to understand is I've seen you share that slide maybe 20 times. I
Right.
did not understand it until yesterday.
Okay.
And so you explained it in a way that then suddenly it was like, oh, now I get it.
Right.
So I think it's a very busy slide, just to warn people, but I think it's one of the most important slides that Jim has up his sleeve.
Okay.
You wearing
And
short sleeves, by the way?
what's that?
You wearing short sleeves?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, okay.
So
You can't hide a whole lot with short sleeves.
no. So the bell-shaped curve, this graph I'm going to share in a second, is made by Grassroots Health. They've made a lot of what I call fear porn built around the 25D molecule, because that's really what it is. You're supposed to believe that if your 25D is low, that means your active vitamin D has to be low too, without ever measuring it. Now, I've shared this a lot, like you said, Morley, actually to the point where Facebook has given me a 30-day ban
I'm
from
sure.
posting it, calling it spam. When I
Well,
posted it last time, I was blocked from Facebook for 30 days. They labeled it spam and blocked me. So it's really sad. You have to be really careful. And it's a scientific, it's supposedly a scientific paper written by Grassroots to tell you the deficiency is real.
It's a very powerful slide. It tells a
Right.
lot.
So I'll go ahead and they've made several versions of this. This isn't the current one. They have a newer one. I really like this one because they put the bell curve on it.
Right.
So let me pull it up here. Let me see if I have it here. Get it on my screen here. Is that, I'm going to have to figure out how to show that to you.
It's an important slide, folks, that I think if we need to take a pause or something to give you a chance to load it up, because I think it really, in a very, again, pictures are worth 1,000 words. In a single picture, it explains what the confusion is.
I guess I don't know how to, oh wait, let me see if I know how to move around in here. I don't know how to move around on my own desktop. I don't know why it's populated this right here. There, wait, here it is.
There we
Did
go.
that show up for you?
Yes, I remember seeing this in your Facebook group because it blew my mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Walk us through slowly, please.
okay, so what they've done, first of all, is they've taken everyone's 2,5-D level, healthy and ill people,
Right.
and they've broken them out into their values. And they've then taken their, let's say you have, I don't know, there's cancers all combined. Let's say breast cancer there. You have breast cancer. They've taken all the breast cancer people and looked at their level of 2,5-D and then blamed that low level of 2,5-D for them getting breast cancer. It's correlation equals causation. And if you notice, the chart's even called disease incidence prevention by serum 2,5-OHD level. So knowing that sick people, and I know this because I've talked to lots of sick people,
Right.
Sick people have high 1,2,5-D.
That's right.
So the people on the left side of this chart with low 2,5-D would be the very people with high 1,25-D. So if we were to turn this chart into a 1,25-D graph, the well people would be on the left and the sick people would be on the right. How can you have a deficiency if you have high 125D, which is what the substrate 25D is made to become? It's a complete disconnect. And that's the main reason they won't measure 125D, is because it doesn't prove any of the associations or correlations with 25D and disease.
Right.
But let's insert a little common sense into this here. We just looked at the circular citations that prop up 25D as being your marker, which drive this graph right here, okay?
Right.
That's a false reality, as I just explained, because the sick people don't have low 125D, what 25D becomes. But let's imagine an atmosphere where we could blame other molecules besides 25D. We should be blaming 125D deficiency for illness.
Right.
Really, but we aren't. We're blaming 25D deficiency, which isn't real. Let's make a chart with another, let's make another nifty chart, as I always say, with other molecules we know matter. Imagine what a graph about magnesium would look like.
That's right.
But could we make that graph and get it peer reviewed and published and blame magnesium for illness? No, the publishing atmosphere is not open with that. No one would peer review it. Could you make one with vitamin K, vitamin C, boron? There's no other molecule you could be so unscientific and make such a crappy graph with and
Right.
ever get it published. It's that atmosphere is only open to vitamin D. If you're willing to call 25D the cause of disease, you can get published.
So just to reinforce this, because I think it's such an important graph, now that I understand it. At the top, well,
Oh, do you want me to leave it up?
yeah, bring it back if you wouldn't mind, just for a couple
No
minutes,
problem.
because I just want to make sure the listeners really understand this, because I think it's very, very important to this explanation. At the very top are the numbers, the values for serum 25 nanograms per milliliter.
Right.
And it goes, where does it start? At 6 and goes all the way up to 68.
Right.
And so the midpoint with that red dotted line is 31, which again, this is the Michael-Holick range is 30 to 100. And so
Right.
everything to the right of that red dashed line is what's considered okay. And the point that Jim is making is that, again, this is a perfect example of flies do not cause garbage. That's what correlation is all about. But what I saw yesterday for the first time was, where is the peak of that bell-shaped curve, Jim?
Right. It's right there at what they call the Ricketts line or whatever.
At the Ricketts line, what's the number there? That number is
20, right? Is
Yeah.
my cursor, does my mouse show up on the screen there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so right here, that's the Ricketts line, the scare you with Ricketts line. Do you know how many people we know that should have Ricketts? You know, there are tons of people with below 20.
Sure. But
You know.
the point is, where is 21 on that chart? It's right
Yeah.
at the top of that L-shaped curve. And
Right.
it turns out that that's exact. I think that what it does is it reinforces those studies that you shared a minute ago, Jim,
Mhm.
that there is no value above 21, because again, this is the storage molecule that has no relevance to disease status, because it's the active molecule that's not on this chart.
Exactly. It's apples and oranges.
Apples and oranges. And people don't realize,
Right.
what's also important for people to realize is that there's a ratio between storage and active.
Right.
And so the most you would want your active number, and again, they're measured in different units. One's peak, the active is picograms, the
Right.
storage is nanograms, but the number for active should be about twice as large as the number for storage. And that's what we did on the MAG group, the MAG Facebook group, is people wanted to talk about how important D was. And I said, we're not talking about D unless you post your blood work for both
Right.
and active. And it took about a year, and suddenly it got quiet when people realized that that supplement was not improving their health.
Right.
They were getting healthy by taking more magnesium. They were feeling pretty good, and their stress was changing, and the numbers started changing, and it was a very powerful experience. But what's entirely missing, and I think this is one of the most important points you make, is where's the active molecule? Why aren't we measuring that? And what study, could you please point me to a study that shows that the active D, the 125 dihydroxy vitamin D3, the active molecule was low in this sick person?
That's the paper I've been asking for a decade, and people don't seem to get that. There's never been a peer-reviewed published paper where the deficiency was demonstrated in the active form. So all the papers that took 2,5-D and blamed it for illness via association would unravel if those people weren't deficient in the 1,2,5-D, showing that they're garbage associations. And I think it was Trevor Marshall or somebody that works with him that says the fire truck could be assumed to start fires because it's highly correlated with them.
Exactly.
But it arrives after the fact, just like 2,5-D being, because of its negative acute phase reactant, it's lower in sick people. It's not the cause, it's a marker.
And the other point that's related to that I think is profoundly important, Jim has alluded to a very important study done by Meg. I pronounce it Mangan, maybe it's Mangan, whatever
Right.
the right one. She's brilliant.
She is.
And so in her article, do you realize that took me 6 weeks to read that article, Jim?
Yeah.
It was like a lot. I had to read a sentence. Think about it.
And it's in nanomoles. So the first time you see it, the numbers look, because they're 50 to 60 instead of 20 to 24, and it throws you off at first. And then you realize, wait, this is saying 20 to 24 is the lowest mortality, but
Right.
It's cited in 50 to 60 nanomole.
Exactly. And the thing that's so important in that study is she talks about why the active vitamin D rises in a disease state. This is incredibly important. It's because the active form, and you can explain this better than I can, Jim, but the active form, as I understand it, can be transformed into what are called acute microbial peptides.
Right.
They're designed to fight the pathogens that are rising in a body that's dealing with some infection. And it's like, it's this amazing response by Mother Nature. Our innate healer says, oh, we need more of this active D so that we can create these acute microbial peptides. And what people haven't figured out is that is also tied to a hormone called hepcidin. And what is hepcidin? Hepcidin comes off of what's called the HAMP gene, hepatic acute microbial peptides.
Right.
And what does hepcidin do? It keeps the iron locked up and in storage so it can't be used by the pathogens. Again, these systems are communicating, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But the
Yes.
important thing for the listeners is active D, never measured, but when it starts to rise, it's rising in response to a threat, an infection. And that's what we want it to do. And Jim's point, I think, which is very, very important, is there's no paper that says that low active D exists with any disease state, because it flies in the face of our innate healer programming.
Right.
That's what people need.
Except for two disease states, and that would be chronic kidney disease, which may have been caused by dousing yourself with vitamin D in the first place, and hypoparathyroidism. Whereas hyperparathyroidism is excess active D. So, but outside of that, and that's what I always say, that's my disclaimer, get me a data set with low 125D, excluding those two conditions. And in over a decade, no one's been able to do that. And I want to talk for a second about Meg. Meg she runs Chronic Illness Recovery. It's a Facebook group. She was with Trevor Marshall at one point with the Marshall Protocol. And Amy Prohl who we're going to talk about in just a second, works with Trevor Marshall. She runs a page called Microbe Minded, because when we talk about all of these disease states, everybody overlooks the pathogens.
Right.
The pathogens are the reason why a lot of people are sick. So I have a history somewhat with Meg. I wouldn't call it personal, maybe professional. When I first discovered 125D through looking at Marshall's work, Meg was already off doing her own thing with chronic illness recovery down in Texas, I think it was.
Right.
I reached out to her and she had a program where she would work with your doctor. And so our doctor, my ex-wife, the doctor I took her to in Redmond, Washington, an environmental doctor, Dr. Busher, he had never worked with Meg before. So she was willing to set up everything for free. And he shared labs. She told him what to study. And as part of that, she gave me access to her entire electronic library, where I started doing my first research into this besides that and the Trevor Marshall group. So I cut my teeth really with her information. And Amy, as I mentioned before, she talks about, there's a paper talking about how vitamin D may be related to why women have 80% of all autoimmune diseases. And she has a really good video, and I'll send that to you after this. I have a couple screenshots from that video I want to share, where Amy was presenting this at a international autoimmune congress that Trevor Marshall was the chair of. It wasn't in the United States. He's one of the foremost human genome experts.
Right.
And before I put this slide up, I want to explain something. So when you have excess vitamin D, 125D in the body, and it can't downregulate itself. So let's say you have Epstein-Barr virus. Epstein-Barr virus makes 3 antigens, EBNA1, EBNA2, EBNA3. Those are all the correct shape to park in the vitamin D receptor, making it unavailable to the active form of vitamin D. Yet their presence in the body and the immune response to their presence in the body will create a lot of 125D. But now it can't access its receptor to do its job. And its job is to create what I've always called the chemical and biological warriors. The biological ones are T cells, macrophages, killer T cells, all those little living things that Pac-Man that go around and tear stuff up. But then the stuff you were talking about before, AMPs, anti-microbial peptides,
Right.
they are the chemical warriors that are much like the acid that the alien made in the movie Alien, that things cannot develop an immunity to.
Right.
Okay, there's no immunity to antimicrobial peptides. So most of the pathogens around today have found a way to block the action of vitamin D so that they don't get attacked by the chemical or biological warriors.
Just real quick, let me
Yes.
with the listeners. So we've established that magnesium is all over vitamin D metabolism. You can't transport it. You can't turn it into the storage form. You can't turn it into the active form.
Right.
And guess what, folks? You can't turn it off without magnesium. So when someone is a stress cadet, they're losing magnesium. Stephanie and I have
Right.
talked about this on several occasions. And so when you have this chronic state of magnesium loss, i.e., for the last 2 years, ding, ding, ding. So low magnesium is going to create a lot of vitamin D dysregulation. Then you're going to become more susceptible to the pathogens are always there.
Right.
What are the pathogens really responding to? If the energy production is a bell-shaped curve inside the cell, and the peak energy production is at the pH of 7.0. Why is that important? Because that's the pH of water. And you cannot turn ADP into ATP inside the mitochondria if the pH isn't 7.0. Really, really important. And so the mitochondria are water wheels, folks. That's where the water gets made to hydrate us. And so that becomes a very important mechanism. And when the pH drops off either way to acidic or too alkaline,
Right.
that's when the pathogens wake up. They're opportunistic. They realize that energy production is down. Oh, now I can take advantage of the situation. What does the body do? It says, hey, we need biological and chemical responses. We need B cells, T cells. We need macrophages. We need, we
Right.
need those chemical guys.
Right.
Guess what all of that runs on, ladies and gentlemen? You got to have energy.
Right. Absolutely. Mitochondrial dysfunction is major nowadays.
And what is the Epstein-Barr living on? Iron, ding, ding, ding.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Almost every pathogen lives off iron.
There's only one that it doesn't live off of, or maybe two. But the thing is, people don't, and I was a little unsure about that until Douglas Kell, world-renowned iron biologist at the University of Manchester, we're doing a Skype call like this. And he says, well, I just want to tell you, you're spot on about pathogens living on iron.
Right. And
And
that's tied to
people
the
need to
iron
know that.
anemia, iron
Exactly.
anemia of chronic disease. You
Right.
know, that's the body holding iron back, sequestering it so that the pathogens can't thrive on it.
Exactly. So people, I think this is such important insights for people to realize that there's a narrative out there about D.
Right.
And we saw that circular reinforcement social circle that said, oh yeah, let's talk about the storage D. Let's ignore the active D. Oh, let's not tell people that magnesium is critical for all of this. And I
Right.
think that's what Meg Mangan's article did for me, was begin to pull the curtain back on how the body responds to inflammation. And it is, what's really important is that there's a internet narrative that all storage D made in the liver, active is made in the kidney. No, it's called extra renal. It means it's made outside of the kidney.
Extra renal. Yep.
It's made by macrophages and I guess other cells. But the important point is it's being done in response to some imbalance, mineral imbalance caused by the stress that the person is under. It's just, people just need to know that there's a very logical explanation for why the body is responding the way it does.
I agree. And I'm glad you brought that up. And I want to actually go back just a little bit because that's a really good point. When I want to share this graphic right here, I changed which slide I wanted to show you. To get back, remember the bell-shaped curve that we shared earlier where they blamed 2,5-D for the disease?
Right.
So this is how vitamin D actually gets its work done in making the chemical and biological warriors.
Right.
Okay, so it's on this side right here that I want to focus. Are you able to see what I'm running my mouse around?
Yeah.
So this is a cell right here expressing a vitamin D receptor right here. And it shows you it's 125D. This is the carrier protein, GC, that brings it here. And so it can either deactivate this way or it goes into the cell. This is going to be a nuclear receptor because it goes into the nucleus of the cell, okay? And we're going to talk about nuclear receptors in just a second. So this is how it works, and I can't see, this is behind the front of my laptop, but you'll see that there are two receptors that come together, the VDR and the RXR. And so there's the molecule of 125D needed, and there's also a molecule of vitamin A needed. And so when they make a bell-shaped curve and they blame everything on not enough 25D, if they haven't measured those people's vitamin A, we could make a chart blaming vitamin A, just like we can make the chart blaming 25D. But what's more interesting about vitamin A is they only found the correct RXR retinol molecule. I believe it's referred to as a retinol molecule in 2016. So all of the prior science looking at the incorrect molecules should have been redone. Nobody rushed around to do that. All that science still stands, unless it's more than 7 years old, Stephanie, and then you wouldn't be allowed to look at it. But so there are many nuclear receptors in the body, and most of them function with a coupling. It's called heterodimerization. Each one is a dimer, and they heterodimerize and come together. The thyroid is exactly the same, and it has a pairing with the RXR as well. So the RXR is the pairing in many heterodimerizations in the cell.
Right. People need to know there's a TR, thyroid receptor, coming together arcs are, just as Jim said, there are about 16 different forms of this heterodimer, as he calls it. Dimer means just two structures,
Right.
two substances coming together. And this is a very, very important point that I'm sure we'll get into in a little bit. But
Right.
again, if you're not aware that mechanism inside the nucleus, the active D, the vitamin D receptor, and the RXR are a triad that need to come together in order to begin to direct the activity of what's called the VDRE, the vitamin D response element. And what you'll see also there is something called coactivators. Now, for the gearheads out there, what I'm learning with increasing zeal, what metal serves as a coactivator for gene transcription? Does anybody know?
Metal. No, you better just go ahead and give it to me.
Copper.
Mm.
Copper, I believe, is a coactivator throughout many, I don't know if it's all, but it's in many transcription sequences. If it's like, oh my, come on, you got to be kidding me. So that histone metabolism, the unwinding of the DNA, the transcription, and guanine, the nucleotide guanine, all have a preferred relationship with copper. That's pretty important to know. So that means what we're really saying is that when there's gene dysfunction or gene defects, first of all, it's probably there's an energy loss, energy
Right.
deficiency, but more importantly, the coactivator is MIA. And that is a really important point for people to understand, that what I love about that slide that you just shared, Jim, is that in a very non-threatening way, begins to pull the curtain back about
Right.
how do genes really communicate?
Right.
What are the most important players? And oh yeah, there is this mechanism inside the nucleus to make it happen. But if copper is not there, that coactivator is like, it's not going to work. It's like,
Right.
let me give you an example. People, we all have kitchens in our home. Yeah, we depend on those kitchens, right? Because that's where we make food. We store it and we make food there. And let's use the stove as an example. Stoves are pretty important. Guess what stoves are made out of? Stoves are made out of steel. Oh, well, actually iron, because that's what steel really is. So that's important to know, that the stove is made of iron. But does the stove decide what we're going to eat? Does the stove prepare the food to be cooked? Does the stove decide how much heat is needed, or whether I should cook it on top of the stove or in the oven? Is the stove doing all that? Or is there, as I call it, a cuisine artist, otherwise known as a chef? Of course, cuisine, you get to separate the CU from the rest of the word, of course. But,
I love it when you do that.
yeah, but we've got to have these cuisine artists. And what I'm learning, Stephanie and Jim, is these cuisine artists are all over the body, not just in the nucleus,
Right.
not just in the mitochondria, in our gut, in our brain, in our eyes, every organ. It's like, and this is not taught in doctor school for one very specific reason. People can connect those dots. So I think that's a very powerful slide that you just exposed, where the real breakdown is. And people don't know there's a triangle down there. There's a triad of players that need to come together. And guess what? The coactivator. We all have these devices that require batteries, right? Right? No. And what's my favorite one? The Duracell battery. Why? Because it's a copper top battery.
There you go.
That's what the coactivator is. It's the battery to make that triad work, so that the expression can take place.
Right.
So people need to understand that. It's like there's a mechanism. And again, I think what it's implying, and correct me if I'm wrong, as I look at that slide, and I've studied that and others like it, that would suggest that the process of of transcription requires energy. Doesn't that seem reasonable?
Right.
There needs to be something, like when we're writing, when we're transcribing something, we're writing, right? There's energy involved in that.
Right.
I think the nucleus is working the exact same way. And that has gone completely unnoticed in the scientific circles.
Right. Right. And when it comes to vitamin D, using that slide in as an example, people seem to think that they can direct that orchestra, whereas it's the body that decides. It decides, number one, if it wants the vitamin D, because it's a foregone conclusion. It knows if it needs the vitamin D, because it knows it has some DNA that it wants to use to transcribe some VDREs. So that then is already decided. Then it will express the vitamin D receptor, having made the molecule it wants to go there, to go into the cell and make the macrophage, the T cell, the anti-microbial peptide. You cannot direct that because you don't know how. It's mechanisms inside the body that you cannot elucidate that decide what's needed. And it happens 1,000 times a second. And the body is, I always say this, the body is 1,000,000 times smarter than the device that people are watching this podcast on. Even though we love our devices and we think how smart they are, the body's wicked smart, way, way more smart than that. And it decides. You don't decide. Your body may not want 25D. It may want one of the other 25Ds that no one's measuring. It may want to put the vitamin D in a completely different pathway. It decides. You don't decide.
Right.
You don't
Innate
decide.
wisdom, rules.
Right.
I remember Carl Sagan talking about when you make the decision to have a sandwich for lunch, it initiates a cascade of 10,000 transactions that are going to get ready for that sandwich to come in. One decision, one conscious decision creates he said, and if you had to stop and think about all 10,000 of those transactions, he said, you'd spend the rest of the day trying to. People don't understand, just as you say, how elegant and brilliant our internal healer and mechanism is inside our body. It's amazing.
Right.
May I ask a question about the graph that you showed? Because I think it's really important, and I'm trying to anticipate listener questions.
Okay, let me pull it back up for you.
Yeah, thank you.
Wait, oops, wrong one.
Imagine why people would
Helps
have
if I do the right one.
Yeah.
Oh,
Imagine why people have a question.
I don't know how to unshare. Let me stop share and pull the right one up first. You wanted the actual, okay, here, I've got it now.
The nucleus. Let's get into that heterodimer, Jim. Come on.
Okay, here we go.
And if you look, folks, if you look,
okay,
closely,
here it is.
the birthday cake and the candles inside the nucleus. If you look.
Okay.
So I think I really love this image, and I would love if you could explain what a VDR is and what an RXR is. Morley, I think, did a really good job explaining copper as a cofactor, but I want the listener to understand what these receptors are and why they're important to the story that we're talking about.
Okay. The VDRs, I don't know what RXR stands for specifically, but a VDR is a vitamin.
Retinoid X receptor.
And I don't know why there's an X in that, but yeah, I guess I did know that's what it's called.
So there's retinoid A receptors,
okay,
O receptors, X receptors, Z receptors, and they have different functions inside the nucleus.
Yeah, and the retinol world is very complex. I could probably spend 3 decades studying that and not learn a lot. But the vitamin D receptors aren't as complex. There's the vitamin D receptor. What it is the body makes a very specific protein. I believe this one's called NR1L1. That it's nuclear receptor 1L1 is its identity. And so it's a specially made protein that the body folds in a very particular way that creates an invagination or a shape in it that can then accept the shape that the vitamin D molecule is as well. And that's why, so we have these antigens of Epstein-Barr. So the only Epstein-Barr around a day happens to make an antigen that just happens to be the right shape, same shape as 125D, so it can sit in there and block the action of vitamin D. That's why it's still around today. So it's just a specially folded protein that the body decides to make. They have a very short half-life, 4 to 6 hours. So when people talk about the short half-life of 125D being a reason to not test it, well, how about its receptor? It's even less. So that matters. There are 2 vitamin D receptors. There's a nuclear one that we see on the right half of this image. It goes in the nucleus and joins the RXR. There's another one called the membrane vitamin D receptor. It has about 4 different names. And it is what they would it's called a cytoplasmic in other literature. It doesn't go into the nucleus. It's made from a different protein. And it works with just vitamin D, but it also uses nutritional ligands, I'm not sure how you say it, like curcumin and things like that. So, and it's a non-genomic rapid response receptor. It works in seconds to minutes, whereas the genomic action of the nuclear VDR takes a long time. And we have confirmed for the nuclear VDR, 913 genes that would be tied to VDREs, vitamin D response elements that it makes. There's well over 5,000 suspected, but it's really, you have to understand there are 2 different ones, and some of the older literature didn't really know which vitamin D receptors it was even assessing in their studies.
So if I'm understanding this right, when you say it's the same shape, is that like I'm thinking of Stephanie Seneff's work where she talks about how glyphosate she makes an argument for molecular mimicry, that it can mimic a glycine molecule. Is that kind of what you're saying here, that it can mimic and bind to the substrate because it's the right shape?
Not bind. In this case, it can go into the pocket. There's actually a pocket made. Imagine when you watch a movie where someone gets their hands on a key and they have some clay in their hand and they push it in there to make a mold of it. And then they're going to go and copy that shape to copy that key. That's that shape in there that accepts it. And so that's how a lot of the molecules dock. You can displace molecules by either having them the same shape, or they can actually contain the same molecules in a different structure. It gets pretty complex when you start looking at that stuff.
Thank you for explaining that, because I think this is a really important image to understand.
Jim, real quick, let me ask a follow-on question to what Stephanie's asked. You may or may not know the answer. What I think you're showing here is outside of the cell, we have this active D. And then what you're showing is it can go 3 different directions, when in fact what you've said earlier is it can actually go 15 different directions. The obvious question is, who's the orchestra leader dictating which direction this active D is going to go? Is it going to go over in a non-genomic action? Is it going to go over into the triad of the VDR and RXR? Or why would the tissue want to turn it off? Who's behind that? Do you have any idea?
It's the body based upon your immune response, more than likely. So up here, it starts with the vitamin D. Does the body want it? Then here's your hepatic enzyme deciding to make 25D. So right in here would be where this doesn't say what it is. If this could be D2 or D3, it could be, this is where there could be 15 different 25Ds. And I can't say for sure they're all made from D3. The vast majority of them are.
Okay.
And then here's going through your liver, the enzyme to make this form. So the body had to decide to make and present this enzyme here, to make this decision. It had to deliver the vitamin D there. And same thing, this is the shuttle, the GC protein, the vitamin D binding protein, a sibling to albumin, and albumin delivers it too. And so then it delivers it here because this vitamin D receptor has been expressed and the body's made the decision to deliver it here, or it may have expressed this one over here, the membrane one, and deliver it there. It may decide to use this enzyme instead and make another molecule, the 2425D molecule, where there's at least 3 2,4, 2,5-Ds. There are way more choices than these three directions.
And what I would invite you to do is put little MGs where they're involved in this chart. I would encourage you to bring the listeners along, not now, but at some future point, and show people where magnesium is involved in all these decisions. The other point that I would make for folks is what is not present in this picture are the mitochondria. And the part that people don't understand, the optics of modern medicine is to get us to believe that the nucleus runs the cell, and that's simply not the case.
Right.
The nucleus runs at the pleasure of the mitochondria. The mitochondria is, in fact, the brains of the outfit, because that's where the energy is. And there's a lot of energy that's involved in thinking and making choices. And what people don't realize is that the biology textbook that we were all raised on had maybe 2 or 3 mitochondria in it, when in fact the average cell has 500. Liver cells have 2,000, kidney cells 4,000, heart cells 10,000, and the mature egg in a woman's body 600,000 mitochondria.
Wow.
In a coordinated fashion. There are brain cells that have 2 million mitochondria. The point is, the key phrase that I use regularly is missing information equals missing truth. And when we don't have minerals on this chart, and we don't have mitochondria in the cell, we don't understand how profoundly influential the energy production is to deciding, are we going to make the 20, are we going to make the 124, 25D? Are we going to have nuclear expression of these other proteins, or are we going to go a non-genomic route? I would argue, I don't have convincing proof, but I would argue that these decisions are based on energy, not on some nuclear, the nucleus decided what to do. It's like, no, the nucleus is a Xerox machine, and it's plugged into the power source that's called the mitochondria. And people have got to start shifting their thinking that if they don't feel well, it's because they're not making enough energy. That's the only reason why. And it's not, and there may be pathogens involved. We know that. But what are the pathogens doing? They're living on excess iron because of a lack of bioavailable copper. And we've talked about that in previous shows. Right. So it's all connected, folks. But that graphic that Jim is sharing is a wonderful gateway into understanding the profound decision-making that needs to be made. We don't see the magician. And I think the magician is in fact our mitochondria making that decision.
I agree. I agree with you there. Absolutely.
So I think a really good place to pounce on next, if I may, Stephanie, please. I want to hear what Jim has to say about the whole dynamic of how people have been trained to believe that they need D to prevent the coronavirus. Because I think that's a major, we've successfully dealt with some of the planks of insanity, but this is another important plank, because then I think it sets the stage for our discussion about vitamin A.
Absolutely.
Okay. I'm gonna round out the dance card, as some people would say, on the 125D, using that nuclear receptors as the segue. So I talked about earlier how when the active form of vitamin D can't get to the vitamin D receptors because, let's say, Epstein-Barr antigen is occupying it, but it's also creating the 125D. So when the vitamin D, when the VDR gene itself loses control, there's excess 125D without receptors for it. And normally, because there's tight regulation, the body doesn't have to worry about how highly attracted that molecule is to the other nuclear receptors. All these molecules have what's called an affinity or an attraction to receptors. And so in the work of Amy Prohl, she has made this graphic that shows, I'll just pop it up. This is taken from a video, like I said earlier, a presentation she did. And This is the affinities of the exogenous, ligands. So inside us, exogenous, not endo, of 125D for other select nuclear receptors. So there is the alpha thyroid. There's 4 of them. They're behind my laptop, so you can see them. Then there's their native ligand, what would normally go to that nuclear receptor.
Wow.
And then there's its own attraction to its own receptor. But then there's the affinity of 125D to it as well. And you see that when you don't have tight regulation and you have excess 125D without a home, like you don't have your parking spot anymore, you'll steal somebody else's. And when you already have a higher affinity, you're going to displace it readily. Look at T3. It'll get displaced by 125D that can't find VDRs very rapidly. This is what I would call the downfall of not being sexist, the downfall of women, especially after a pregnancy, where they have the piling on of multiple autoimmune diseases in each one of those systems. And that's what this paper is getting at, that vitamin D dysregulation can lead to the autoimmune diseases that are more common in women. And you see every one of those examples shows that not tightly regulating 125D has an effect on those 4 systems right there.
That is one heck of a blockbuster slide.
No, I want to somehow, can I have a link to that slide or some,
I'll send you that video, and including her paper. She's presenting her paper at this, and so I'll send you the paper and this video.
Because those are 4 of the most common things I run into. Oh,
So
sorry.
I'm sorry, forgive me, Steph. So the numbers there, Jim.
Yeah.
Are those speed?
No, I don't know how they measure their attraction. They're able to measure that. I don't know what the unit of measure is. Trevor Marshall does a lot of this work. It's just the science that they do at a very deep level that shows affinity to receptors.
I just want a quick digression. I want people to understand that a lot of people were, and maybe still are, taking the COVID cocktail, ascorbic acid, vitamin D, and zinc, thinking that that was going to prevent them from getting the common cold, which is basically what it was. But when you ingest zinc, zinc triggers the synthesis of a very powerful metalloprotein called metallothionein. It shouldn't be called metallothionein. It should just be called copper thionein. It binds up copper 1,000 times stronger than it binds up zinc. So instead of the difference being 6.79 to 8.41, it would be 6.79 to 6,000. And that people don't understand what the order of magnitude is of responding to that one supplement that they've been taking for 2 years now. So I'm fascinated. This is one of the most thought-provoking slides I've seen in several years. So thank you for sharing it. But it's like, it's that we could spend 2 days just talking about that one slide, Jim.
Right. And I'm going to use this as a jump off point to blow everybody's mind about the immune system next. But you mentioned zinc. So I want to say something about zinc real quick. And it's tied to COVID. Like you said, remember I said that a vitamin D receptor has a very short half-life. Okay. Protein protease will come in and destruct it. Capnase, I think, is the term. The other form, they can get utilized. They go away in that fashion. But I believe it's the DNA binding domain of a receptor. We were looking at the receptor earlier where we showed the RXR and the VDR coming together. And so where that stuff occurs, the DNA has a binding zone too. So each DNA is different. It's going to make a specific VDR. In order for that DNA to bind there, it parks in 2 zinc fingers. Okay, so the receptor expresses 2 zinc fingers for it to park in. So zinc is very important to the dynamic expression of receptors as part of your immune response. So
but
you
zinc,
can burn through zinc
yes,
when
but
you're sick.
Zinc coming from a diet, I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe zinc coming from a diet is different than the zinc found in a bottle. And we're trained to believe that they're the same thing, and I do not think they are.
No, that
That's
wouldn't
just,
surprise me. That wouldn't
that's just,
surprise me at all.
yeah, that's
Just
just.
like folic acid isn't the same as folate.
Exactly,
Folic acid doesn't exist in nature. They created it, tested it in pigs, and then leashed it on us before they tested it in humans.
exactly.
So,
Mm.
so this is going to be a connection to what you talked about earlier, the antimicrobial peptides, the acid, the chemical warriors that the pathogens cannot develop an immunity to. Okay, that's a very important function of vitamin D. It makes those antimicrobial peptides. And the thing about that is, so imagine if your vitamin D can't get to its receptor, it cannot make its chemical and biological warriors. So you've shut down your immune response as far as the vitamin D that they have you focused on, right?
Say that again, please. Say that sentence once more.
So when the 125D cannot get to its receptors,
Got it.
say Epstein-Barr is occupying it,
Okay.
it's unable to make what the body wants. It can't
Right.
make antimicrobial peptides or macrophages, T cell. It can't make any of those things. So you've gone and you've taken that system out. And one way you do is by having too much 25D. It can steal the receptors as well. Okay, in a dose-dependent fashion. We won't get too into that, but that's in Marshall's work. So you don't have to necessarily lose it to pathogens. You can overload on too much of 25D. So, but when you then lose other receptors to the 125D, like the T3 receptor here in
Right.
this graphic that's up, when you lose that, people don't realize that that's also going to take out your immune system. Let me shut this off for a second and change the slide, since I don't know how any other way, at least to change it to the right one. I'm going to show you another screenshot from the same presentation. Get this up on here. Okay. This one here. Okay. Are you seeing the one that talks about the antimicrobial peptides on your screen?
Sure.
Okay, so here we have on the left 3 systems. Okay, on the bottom is the vitamin D receptor.
Right.
Like I said, it's hidden. I think it says it makes 10 antimicrobial peptides there.
16.
16. Okay, and it names them.
Yep.
Now what people don't realize is that the other receptors also make chemical warriors, antimicrobial peptides. So your androgen receptor is busy at that. We look behind there. It makes 17. Some of them are the same. The glucocorticoid, it makes 20. It's got additional ones. These are all the antimicrobial peptides that the body uses, the chemical warriors the body uses to defend you and protect you. So when you have too much 125D without a home, you lose the function of the vitamin D receptor immune response. Then when it displaces the other system's native ligands, you lose their antimicrobial peptide and their function as well.
Right.
The cascading autoimmune disease layering, the downfall of the immune system.
So then with this very powerful information, so why is there perception that if I take vitamin D, I won't get sick?
Oh, that's a really good question, and I'm glad you brought it up. Okay, so without getting into the technicalities of it, when the body senses that there's too much vitamin D and it can't access its own receptor and downregulate itself, the VDR gene goes into something called VDR deactivation mode. It ceases to express vitamin D receptors. It knows when the pathogens are stealing the vitamin D receptors. So it shuts itself down. There's a huge paper on it. It's about jaw osteomyelitis. I may say it wrong.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. In that case, pathogens have taken the jawbone over. And in order to rebuild the jawbone, which people is very desirable to have your jawbone exist,
Right.
they know they can't just go in there and remodel it and have it last if it's just going to get destroyed again. So they've done really deep science on this. And they have written a paper, there's a big paper about this that covers many of the pathogens that block the action of vitamin D. Even the oldest human disease, leprosy, blocks the antimicrobial peptides. So the body then ceases to express vitamin D receptors. That sets your sensitivity to vitamin D. You won't even absorb it. You'll ignore it. That's a sick person, okay? Their body doesn't want more vitamin D if there's no use for it because there's no vitamin D receptors. So let's talk about everybody they pull into let's use COVID. They pull thousands of people into a COVID study and they make a fear porn. Let me pull up a fear porn for COVID. Grassroots Health will create a fear porn graphic to make you think if you don't have enough 2,5-D, you're going to be in trouble. Okay, is that showing for you?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so the level of vitamin D is at the very top there. So below 90, 20 to 29, above 30, with the red being the severity of, and so what they're trying to sell you the idea here is correlation equals causation. So the 25D is why they did terrible. Just like the other graph, we don't know their vitamin A level. We don't know if they had active vitamin or magnesium to activate it. We don't know any of those things. This is by Grassroots Health. And so you're to believe the 25D level is what did it. So you have thousands of people pulled into this test that are not this one per se, but in general, and have their 25D measured, and then they blame the 25D for the severity. Just saying, if you had more 25D, you'd be better. Keep in mind, the people whose body has decided it doesn't want 25D, they won't absorb vitamin D. Their body will ignore it. People that are sick struggle to raise their 25D level through D3 supplementation or sun for that matter, because the body does not want it. Whereas people that don't have a comorbid condition, their VDRs aren't deactivated, they don't have, they're not suffering from the impact of negative acute phase reaction to an inflammation insult, they can raise their 25D. So when you bring people into these studies, there's the healthy and there's the sick people brought in. The sick people are going to have lower 25D from the get-go. They're the sick people. They're not going to fare as well. They have comorbidities. They might have diabetes. They might have TB. They might have cancer, any number of comorbid conditions. That's what's already driven their 25D down. It's the marker. Remember, it's the marker for their illness, not the cause. Those are the people that will have very high 125D, in fact. So then let's say it's an intervention study. So they're going to look at them from the get-go, but then they're going to give them 25D or D3. Sometimes they do give them 25D. So the people who are able to increase their vitamin D level during that study, again, they're the healthier people, they will end up having their ability to increase their 25D during the study with their doing better. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
Did I explain that well?
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
And that's how they sell it. And they drive all that home in a circular fashion. Look, people with better 25D levels do better. People that increase their 25D levels during this intervention do better. They're the healthier people. If you would look behind the curtain and graph those people's 125D, this chart would be inverted again. The people with the highest 125D would be the ones with the red bad outcomes.
Yeah.
It would be entirely different. They'd be on the right side, not the left side. And they can't expose that. And the cynical me is going to say, why? We have had a deficiency since the 30s. We're all fortified. And it's now with the new goal, it's not enough. And so they're pumping vitamin D into people as interventions, as fortification, justification of everything. If all of a sudden there were tons of data sets that showed that no one sick is suffering a true deficiency, they all have hypervitaminosis D, you would be creating data sets that would drive class action lawsuits against intervention, against medical treatment, against fortification. So we're not going to see those data sets created. That coupled with the fact that the doctors are trained not to test it specifically through their, including through the insurance companies, because a 125D test is a lot more expensive than a 25D test, because it has an 8 to 12 hour half-life. That sera has to be frozen immediately, frozen the whole time. If it took 2 days, 3 days in transport with an 8 to 12 hour half-life, you'd have no 125D left for them to even run the lab on. So it's much more costly.
But what people need to understand is we're talking about hormones here, folks. This storage and active is not a vitamin. It is, in fact, a hormone. And every other hormone that's studied in the human body is studied with storage levels and active levels. And somehow they have the wherewithal to do it with all the other hormones. But with this one, oh gosh, no, this is really complicated. And the corollary or the parallel issue is with again, it's not a vitamin, it's a hormone. The difference between retinoic acid, these are very powerful hormones. You know, all trans retinoic acid, 9 cis, 11 cis, 13 cis. These are really powerful hormones. And yet all we are left with is, well, I can measure your serum level in the blood and I can tell you about the binding protein, but I can't seem to get to this active hormone status. It's like people don't realize that we're being cherry picked to death with the data that we're given. It's it's really it's unfair, and the level of information that's available for hormones storage and active is pervasive, Dutch tests and all these different tests. But when it comes to these very powerful fat soluble hormones that dictate how our immune system runs, well, I'm sorry, it's really expensive and I can't do it, and I'm not going to train you anyway. And people don't realize how manipulated the system is to corral us into thinking there's only one way to measure it, and it's a vitamin. Wink, wink. Trust me on that. It's like people don't understand the games that are being played.
Right. And
Jim, may I ask or make an observation about the chart you just had up? Because,
do you want it back up?
Yeah, just for a second, because you mentioned something earlier that this graph shows, and I wanted to point it out because so this is a COVID-19 severity vitamin D level. Obviously, it was printed in 2020 after COVID-19 began, and the levels are based off of this new Michael Hollick ideal of what's considered low and what's not considered low.
Right, exactly.
So if COVID would have happened in 1995 or something, like these levels would not be what they are on this graph. So even the levels are different. I just wanted to make that observation.
No, that's just like I was talking about. You go to old citations when most of the people in the study wouldn't be deficient. The same thing applies here. And before we switch gears to anything else, I wanted to point out something else. So in changing that goal, they have to prop that goal up. This is one way they do it, with this circular citations in their papers or with studies that only look at 25D. And then another way they do it is they talk about how we get sick in winter when we have a vitamin D deficiency. We don't have a vitamin D deficiency in winter. We have lower 25D because it has a seasonal variation, because we don't make D3 in the winter. We don't see any change in our 125D because it's the molecule of immune response. It
Most important fact right there.
Yeah, it's a diurnal rhythm. It's made as needed. It's made based upon your immune response. There's a range for it. Sick people, when you have an insult, may be higher, but it's very stable. You see a slight change throughout the day based upon having a meal. I haven't delved in that. It could be because you ate something that contained 125D. Some things do, nightshades do. But to say that we have a deficiency in winter when we actually get sick, that would be the dumbest immune system. As a species, we would have perished eons ago. The reason we get sick in winters, that's when you get sick, first of all, with the exception of polio. And because of host aggregate, people move around a lot. Terms of schools end, they take germs or whatever you want to say with them, share them, and absolute humidity plays a role as well.
Humidity is
You
huge.
do not see a change in people's 125D level despite a change in their 25D.
And when you look at it as the astrobiologists have, people need to know that actually it was vitamin A that was on the planet first, 700 million years before vitamin D came on the scene. That's not an insignificant time period.
Right.
And so what is vitamin A? Vitamin A is a light sensor. Oh, there's light. What are we going to do with this light? How are we going to use those photons? How can we
Right.
take advantage of that electricity? And what is vitamin D? Sunglasses. It's
Right.
a light filter. And it makes perfect sense that the filter, it's like so simple, but the light filter, the sunglasses are more prevalent in the summer when there's more sunlight, we need more filter, and we
Right.
need less filter when there's not as much sunlight, which is what happens during winter. And it's like, and the guy who figured that out was Weston A. Price. He's like, wait a minute, there's a seasonal variation here. And he's the one to figure out, oh, it must be blocking the sunlight. And that's exactly what vitamin D does. It blocks light. And we all think, oh, it's the sunshine vitamin. No, it is the darkness filter.
Yeah.
People
That's-
don't understand.
That's
it.
interesting. Well, the retinol, I've always found that compelling, but you're right. In fact, in the earliest studies, they were looking at eukaryote organisms, and D2 is their sunscreen. It literally functions as their sunscreen. And when you go in the sun and you start to get darker, melanogenesis, when you start to make or rearrange or make new melanin, it's
Right.
to shade the folate so it doesn't get
Definitely.
degraded.
Now,
So,
Jim,
yeah,
I hope you're
that makes
basing
sense.
that observation on literature that's not more than 8 years old, I hope.
Oh, I'm not. I go further back than that.
Well, the best
yeah.
research is back in 1910, 1920, 1930. Those are amazing studies, but I digress.
Yeah.
So maybe a point about A and D in terms of their relationship. Do you have anything you want to share there in terms of whether one might influence the other and vice versa?
Well, when we're dealing with the genomic response making VDREs, I mean, you absolutely have to have both of them.
Right.
But every study's not only going to fail to look at the 125D level, it's not going to look at the vitamin A. It's not going to look at the cofactor magnesium. It's not going to look at any of that, unfortunately. And I want to say one more thing about the darkness before we go on, though. There's an IOM, Institute of Medicine response, talking about how they felt like 20 was definitely a sound number to shoot for, and that 12.5 is a lot more realistic for most people. And it was by Joel something in this article, and I have it. He talks about how evolutionarily more vitamin D doesn't make sense. It's very rare in foods.
Yeah.
And you turn darker to block overproduction of it as well. So this emphasis on wanting to have very high levels of it just doesn't make sense. And as part of this grassroots work, which I was just showing, one of their fear porn things is, there's a paper out there called The Big Mistake, where they try to talk about how the Institutes of Medicine made an error when they said 700 IU was enough to get everyone to 20. And they said they had a couple different groups look at their statistics work and found an error in it at a magnitude of 10, and that people needed 7,000 IU to attain a level of 20 IU. Anyone that has studied vitamin D very much at all, or at least tried to get an idea what they need to take based upon looking at their levels, say they go to Medscape and they want to look at the influence of inputs.
Right.
Each 1,000 IU is roughly worth 10 points NG. So in order, these people actually have a paper out there that said they need 7,000 to get to 20. Keep in mind, this is on top of whatever your natural level was to begin with. 7,000 IU would bump you up typically 70 points. And they're trying to sell the idea that it would get the vast majority of people to 20 by pointing out a quote mistake in the statistics by the IOM. The IOM got it right. 700 would move most people, about 7 points. And if 7 points is going to get you in that sweet spot of 20 to 24, more than likely for everyone, even the people that are really worried. And you can get that from food, whole food, very easily.
So Stephanie, it seems like we're unveiling the mass dysfunction formation that's taking place in society. People don't realize what's going on. What are your thoughts? I mean, what I've enjoyed about this is one of the most relaxed discussions I've ever participated in about a very important topic. So Jim, I give you high praise for that.
Thank
But
you.
I'm mindful of the hour. I'm mindful of the attention span of the listener, and I'm wondering if it might be fun to let me share a couple little factoids about A, and then maybe what we do is schedule a follow-up three-way to do part 2 of this, because I think what we've done is we've set the stage, Jim, by virtue of the slides that you've shared, is given the listener a completely different understanding of some really critical facts, so they can have a better discernment and make better decisions about what to do. But I think the point that is not well understood, and I'll just, what I'd like to do with your permission, Stephanie, is just share a couple ideas, if that makes sense to you. Would that be a good way to try to bring us back to the A discussion and then bring us to a close? Would that be a good way to do this?
I'm great with that. If y'all are okay with that, I love the idea. And Jim, I don't want to impose on you. I'd love the idea of meeting again. I have several questions from my community on this topic.
Oh yeah, we want to do those.
Yeah, and I think and some really good questions too, by the way. And I think if we, release this episode, give people the opportunity to continue to ask questions, I can kind of select themes, and maybe when we meet again, we can go over some of them.
Sure.
If you're open to that. I don't want
I'm very open to that. I want to do that.
Well, great. Then Morley, yeah, I think that's a great idea. If you want to share your facts, and then we can close up. And
just a couple points, because I think people need to understand that we are witnessing global brainwashing, and the propaganda arm behind this is staggering. And I think it would have been a little uncomfortable to say that in 2019. I think people know exactly what we're talking about now. So you mentioned Hector DeLuca. He was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. People don't know what the history of UW-Madison is. It was the Center for Lipidology, the study of fats. It was the preeminent center for the study of fats. And one of the scientists that I had the pleasure of meeting, and I think Stephanie, you and I talked about this, was Frederick Kummerow. I met him when he was 98 years old.
Wow.
He'd gotten his PhD at UW-Madison in 1940. Wow. I know that's long ago. And what did he know? He was an old man. But when I met him at 98, he was still working 20 hours a day at his lab at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. Very vital, vibrant, very intense guy. And he had invited me down to his home for lunch, grass-fed burgers and homegrown tomatoes and chocolate milk. It was quite a meal. And I asked him, he was there. He was, what was the focus when he was there? Oh, we were studying vitamin A. Mm-hmm. Interesting. And so what's happened at UW, people don't understand what they did. In 1928, that was the center that figured out that if copper is low in an animal's diet, iron rises in the liver. It's axiomatic. And for the folks who don't understand, your diet is low in copper. So therefore you are accumulating iron in your body, and it's not your friend. And this was an established fact in 1928. And when did they figure it out genetically? 2021. Lee Gonzalez figured it out. And it's an amazing study that, in fact, they were right in 1928. They didn't know genetically what was happening. But under copper deficiency, one gene upregulates, and it's called the ferritin light chain gene, FTL1, and it takes off into orbit in a state of copper deficiency. And what is it doing? It's downloading iron into the liver because it knows the body can't work with it. Well, that's not your friend, especially if you're trying to make vitamin D. And so when I was with Dr. Kumro, I said, so what's your position on vitamin D? He said, well, I studied it for a decade. He studied it in pigs. People don't know that pigs and humans are pretty much the same, in many ways. But he was invited in the early 80s to a conference, international symposium on vitamin D supplementation. He was one of the keynote speakers. And I said, what happened? He said, well, I got up. He said, I told him you don't supplement with vitamin D because it causes, again, he was following one pathway, one of those 15 pathways, creates a hyperbolic increase of calcium, which is on your chart that people could see inside the cell. But the point is, he told them you do not supplement, and people went bonkers because they had Nobel laureates there. I said, well, what actually happened as a result of your stance? And you got to picture this guy, 98 years old, full of life, full of vim and vigor. Glint in his eye, looks me right in the eye and says, well, Morley, I'm the only one left standing. All the others are dead. And so he understood vitamin D very differently than anyone because he went to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where they studied lipids better than anybody else. And the origin of UW-Madison was all about retinol. Well, now it's flipped. And Hector DeLuca only has 3 buildings named in his honor at the University of Wisconsin, which means the narrative is flipped. And people don't. So again, 1984, black is white, white is black. Citizens become enemies of the state. Folks, there is a narrative and it's flipped. And so now we're supposed to be drowning ourselves in D and ignore A. Oh no, A is a toxin, don't you know? So it makes no sense. And there really is an axis in the body. There are many axes. There are many axes. But a critical axis is between copper and retinol, and the other axis is between iron and vitamin D. And people don't realize that these nutrients exist in pairs, exist in relationship with each other. They are yin and yang, frick and frack, Laurel and Hardy. They are teams. And if what's really hard for people to process is, in the world of homeopathy, copper is called the general. In the world of homeopathy, iron is called the foot soldier. Well, we all know from our movies that we've watched, or maybe we've been in the military, we know that there are only a few generals, but they carry a lot of sway and they shape the direction and activity of a lot of foot soldiers. Well, that's copper inside the body. That's the cuisine artists inside our mitochondrial kitchens. And copper and retinol have a profound relationship with each other in that you cannot absorb fat. Excuse me, you cannot absorb copper if you don't have fat in your diet. And you cannot metabolize fat if you don't have copper in your tissue. So the enzymes to break down fat, including this fat-soluble vitamin that everyone's taking, require copper. And there are aspects to this that are very, very subtle, but they're very significant. But everything changed when I read 2 different studies from 2013 about the immune system. One is by Mawson, M-A-W-S-O-N, talking about vitamin A and vitamin D in the immune response to influenza. And then the other was by Conway, 2013, also talking about both of these nutrients being critical for our immune function. And both studies made this declaration in the study that if you take too much vitamin D, it's going to block retinol uptake. Ding, ding, ding.
Yeah.
Well, the first one was Mawson, and it was a chicken study. And I thought, oh, come on, there's got to be more to it than that. Well, Conway has 7 footnotes around this one subject. One of them being the chicken study that Mawson had. But 7 studies begins to establish a foothold of truth for people to understand that, again, these nutrients are yin and yang. And it's very important to know that you want balance and symmetry in your diet, but you need to understand that it doesn't mean that they are of equal proportion. They may have far greater impact. Like a little bit of copper carries tremendous influence over a lot of iron. But the important thing about retinol is, and Jim has alluded to it, and if we reassemble, I'll come with slides. I didn't have slides, Jim. I appreciate you doing that. I've got some slides that I can share with the listeners. But it's important for people to realize that the downstream role of retinol, see, the thing is, sunlight activates the mechanism to make vitamin D. Well, sunlight activates a completely different mechanism to break down retinol into its component parts so it can be used inside the body. And those components are called, the term is retinoid, which I think is an odd word to use, but that's what it's referring to. But retinoids become these retinoic acids. They become retinaldehyde, which needs to be metabolized, and it becomes these nuclear receptors. But there are many other functions that they engage in, and that is completely lost on the global population because they've never heard about retinol. And what they're being trained to believe is that, oh, it's a toxin now. And as soon as people need to really question their sources, if they're talking about copper and vitamin A as toxins, then maybe that's not a credible source of information for you because they're not really explaining the profound relationship of those 2 nutrients to create what's called bioavailable copper. And Steph and I have talked about that on several occasions. And we're going to talk about it again face to face in a few days, which I can't wait because I've got even more goodies to share with you, Steph. But the thing is, people, we've been corralled into a very narrow understanding. I think what Jim has done today is really shattered this childlike understanding we have of vitamin D. Well, I can assure you, we have an equally, and maybe even more so, childlike understanding of vitamin A because we're not aware. Get it? Aware. We don't even know that retinol is important. And what are the richest sources of retinol? Well, free-range eggs, very important source of retinol. Heavy cream. Oh, I've got a dairy allergy. Grass-fed butter. I've got a dairy allergy. Grass-fed beef liver. I've talked to over 6,000 people in 10 years. I have a list of 13 people who got excited they could eat beef liver. 13 out of 6,000. So people are afraid of liver, and it's not just a source of copper. It's a very rich source of retinol. And then we've got cod liver oil. And don't you know that, well, cod liver oil, it's like when you get into a discussion about the 100 different versions of cod liver oil out there. And so it's a very checkered field out there to weave people into a very safe path. But the magic is between retinol and copper. And let me give an example. And maybe this will be a note to end on, and we can set the stage for how we're going to do Q&A and things like that. Everybody's worried about neurodegeneration. I think everyone should be worried about neurodegeneration, especially in light of COVID. People don't realize that the olfactory nerve is where COVID comes into our system, and it has a heat-seeking process into the brain. And the incidence of Parkinson's has risen ever since COVID came on the scene. That should make everyone kind of uncomfortable in their chairs right now. And where's the crisis in our brain? Well, we have blood vessels up there, and there are cells on the inside of the blood vessel called endothelial cells. They're very important for monitoring what's going on with the blood and the viscosity of it, and how's the capillary feeling. But then there's something called the blood-brain barrier on the other side of it. And there's a little process that the brain goes through to get nutrients on the other side into the brain tissue. And one of the most important bridges inside to get across the endothelial layer and into through the blood-brain barrier, something called lipid rafts. Oh, we're back to those fat things again, huh? Lipids. Oh, maybe Dr. Kumaro could help us. Well, Dr. Kumaro passed away at the age of 102. So he had a very full life. And on his 100th birthday, Jim, Dr. Liz and I called him to celebrate his birthday. We sang him happy birthday. And I asked him, I said, Dr. Kumar, are you still working just as hard as you were when I met you? And he snapped at me. He said, Morley, I'm not done yet. At the age of 100. So the thing is, these lipid rafts, there's a lock and key to make the lipid rafts work. And the key is something called copper. You know, that coactivator thingy that we were talking about? So we got copper, and then we have something called the prion protein. And if anyone knows about mad cow disease and they think it's a disease, it is not a disease. It's a clinical sign of copper deficiency, ding, ding, ding. But the thing is, if copper and prion protein work, it makes the lipid raft work. Why is that important? Because there's 42 different peptides that need to get on the other side, need to be expressed, need to be recycled, need to be eliminated. And they can't get to the other side if the lipid raft is not properly energized. And the most important would be amyloid plaque, tau proteins, alpha-synuclein, ApoE. These are the four biggies that are driving neurodegeneration, folks. And the mechanism is so subtle that if the enzyme ATP7B doesn't have access to retinol, it cannot run its mojo to be the copper pump to put it in the enzymes that are needed to allow the bridge to work. And that's how subtle this is, folks, that these very significant conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and Lou Gehrig's disease are all resting on this little lock and key between copper and prion proteins, all for the lack of retinol in our diet. And all for the fact that hyperdosing of D blocks the uptake of retinol in your body and in your brain. And I just want to set the stage for people to realize that there is way more to the story than just vitamin D. And we have been hoodwinked beyond belief over the last several years. And there's plenty more to talk, but I think we've exhausted this discussion right now. But I think it's important for people to keep an open mind that there really is an amazing mechanism inside our body that keeps track of all of this and knows exactly what it needs. And when I first heard the phrase innate healer, when Dr. Liz used that term, I thought to myself, why do we have doctors if there's an innate healer? And so I set out to find out who the innate healer is. And long story short, it's copper enzymes. And the part that's really important, which we'll get to next time we chat, is there's a part of our brainstem. We have a vagus nerve. People know about the central nervous system. Well, there's a vagus nerve that's communicating what's going on in the organs. We're keeping track of what's happening. Is there inflammation there? And the vagus nerve ends its journey at a part of the brainstem called the locus ceruleus. It's the size of your thumbnail, 50,000 neurons. It's also called the blue dot. There's a really clever article. Hey, doctor, why is there a blue dot on my MRI? And it's the color blue, just like ceruloplasmin, as we've talked about, is blue. Well, the blue dot, locus ceruleus, has 10 times more copper than any other part of the brain. Think that might be important? Yeah, I do too. So what is it doing? It's making noradrenaline. No, it makes 70% of the noradrenaline needed in the brain to calm down inflammation, to dampen down the hydrogen peroxide that's being made. And why is this so important? Guess who runs and regulates the blood-brain barrier? It's called the locus ceruleus. Now, here's the part that I find absolutely fascinating. It was first discovered in 1808. When was it first understood clinically? 2017. 200 years later. It took 200 years. The choroid plexus, another very important brain center. It's where cerebral spinal fluid is made. It's a copper-dependent function. It's a good thing to know about. They discovered it over 100 years ago. When did they start really understanding what its purpose was and what the breakdown was? About 20 years ago. So there are these massive holes in our understanding of what's driving our dysfunction.
Right.
And people need to realize that Jim and I and Stephanie and others we're like citizen scientists trying to bring forward this truth so that people can make more informed decisions about what to do. Because the narrative that we're being bombarded with is very different than Mother Nature. Nature versus narrative, they're completely different. And and I think Jim has done a masterful job today of showing the disconnect between this is nature, this is what we see in the literature, the narrative. And we just need to kind of accept that, and it's uncomfortable, but it's really, really important. And I look forward to being able to share more about retinol's roles and responsibilities in the body, because it's profound, and it's important for people to know that for their own health and well-being.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you make one heck of a foil, Jim. You're just your depth of understanding on the D side. I think we got to create an A&D roadshow and just yammer with Justin and Matt and whoever, just to get more people to be aware of this.
Right.
It's a elegant dance between the two, and
Right.
you can't have one without the other.
Right.
Yeah, Jim, you blew my mind today. With your slides. There's so many aha moments, and that one in particular that showed, low T3, androgens, cortisol. I forget. Progesterone was the last one. Like those are the most common things that I see in my practice. Like people struggling with those things, and that was a real aha moment for me that vitamin D is playing a role in this.
Right.
You realize or not.
Right. And I mentioned, pregnancy, and some of that I said following pregnancy a lot of times is a downfall for women, and they might be almost infertile after that. They may try to have a second child or third child. It's important to understand that they have 40% spikes in the active form of vitamin D when pregnant, but they're being labeled deficient, and a lot of them are taking vitamin D during that time.
Yeah.
And the big issue in pregnancy, just to amplify it, there's a download of copper. So the three of us have about 100 milligrams of copper in our body that fits on the head of a 1-inch stick pin. It's a little tiny bit. And there's 7 milligrams of that copper is in our liver. Just a little tiny bit. Again, little battery running a big big machine, right?
Right.
So when we were born, when the three of us were born, Jim and I were born about the same vintage, a few years before you were born, Steph. But when we were born with livers that had 70 milligrams of copper. So our moms gave up, and all mammals do this, folks. All mammals have this enormous download of copper in the last trimester, because that, coupled with the retinol that the mammal gets with breastfeeding, that forms the immune system for the first 2 years of life.
Cool.
That's important to know. And so if the co-activator is downloaded in the mom and she doesn't have a lot to begin with, the baby's not born perfect, but the baby will take whatever it can get.
Right.
And Jim's absolutely right. These moms that struggle to get pregnant for the first child and struggle to get pregnant with the second and third, well, one of the real key stumbling blocks is their copper status. And what happens after they've donated the copper? Well, they get postpartum depression. They get all sorts of hormone dysregulation and all these other factors. It's all because the co-activator is MIA in their body.
Interesting.
And you got to have the copper and the retinol in order to bring the body back into balance.
Yeah.
Right.
And to add insult to injury, they're being told, well, you need to supplement with vitamin D. And that's
Absolutely.
making the situation worse.
Yeah, iron and D for pregnant women. It's like, wait a minute, why don't we talk about magnesium, copper, and retinol? Let's start there.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, a lot of my listeners are like mothers of young children, first-time moms, and they're just trying to make better decisions for themselves and their family.
Absolutely. Right.
And so that's one of the most common questions I get is, hey, my doctor's giving me a hard time. They really want me to take vitamin D. What do I do? Hey, my breast milk does not have very much vitamin D, and they're telling me to supplement and give my child vitamin D. What do I do? And it's just, and I think that's why I feel like this is such an important message, because we're setting the next generation up for failure this way.
Right.
You're absolutely right, Steph.
That's why I really wanted to talk with you guys about this. And I so appreciate your time and your expertise. You are changing lives. You are helping so many people with your research and your message. And, you know, as somebody who's in this space, who, Jim, you probably don't know this. I worked in traditional medicine for a long time as an occupational therapist. And I realized, oh, this system it's not helping people the way that it should.
Right.
So then I entered functional medicine, thinking that, oh, this is going to be it. This is going to be the place for me. And then I realized, well, wait a second, the things that they're promoting, I don't think they're helping people either.
Right.
And that's why my podcast is called Revolutionary Health, because I'm trying to pave my own way to figure out my own thoughts, because just in clinic and recent, like just anecdotal evidence of my clients, my caseload. I mean, everything you talked about today, that's what these people are experiencing. And I just keep thinking, like with the low T3, well, they're not even getting their T3 measured. They're getting their T4 measured, and then they're given Synthroid, which again is adding insult to injury. And then they're being told to supplement with vitamin D. And it's just, it's overwhelming in some ways. But I think that the more we talk about this, the more these things will begin to click, and people will start making better decisions. They'll start voting with their dollars on that are, you know, if we stop buying vitamin D, maybe they'll stop making it. I don't know.
So if you go into the literature stuff.
What's that?
If you go into the literature and you have the courage to look at the 40s and 50s, maybe the 60s, and you study breast milk, guess what you're going to find? There's this much vitamin D. There's this much iron in breast milk.
Yeah.
Mother Nature does not want iron and vitamin D in the breast milk for a reason. And what is Nestle doing? It's completely altering that, because there's 40 times more iron in infant formula than there is in modern day breast milk. 40 times.
Right. Yep.
And that is a toxic dose of iron that's going to affect the brain and metabolism of the infant.
Right. And there's 13 times the natural amount of vitamin D. 13.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Gee, I wonder why there's a problem with the world these days.
Exactly.
Yeah, you guys.
But you've got to have the courage to abandon the current literature and get back to the real literature when when the motives were very different back then.
Right, exactly.
Yes, I agree. And Morley, one of the first things you ever said to me when we very first met was, and I will keep this with me for the rest of my life. You told me, you know what your problem is, Steph? You're George Bailey and you think you're living in Bedford Falls, but you're really living in Pottersville. And the moment you realize you're living in Pottersville, you'll be better for it. And I'm constantly putting on my Pottersville goggles because my natural inclination is to be in Bedford Falls, and I'm really working hard to wake up and understand what's really happening in the world around me.
No,
Right.
and people need to know that. And I think the blessing, there was a blessing to 2020 and 2021 is we got to wake up and realize we are in Pottersville.
Yeah.
And not everyone's awake, but more people, many more people.
Right.
Certainly there are a bunch of people in Canada, but it's like people are waking up to the reality. It's like, oh my gosh. And,
Right.
and the phrase that I used at a meeting yesterday, I said, folks, Matrix was not a movie, that was a documentary. So
I still need to see that.
this has been an amazing discussion.
Well, thank you both for being here. I really, again, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you
Mhm.
just so willingly share your education expertise with all of us. We're all the better for it. I'm a firm believer that when we know better, we do better. This is a great opportunity for my community to learn how to do better. Any closing thoughts before I end this recording?
No, I think I'm good. You didn't have any questions that you needed to ask, or did you want to save that for another time?
Yeah, I'll save it for another time, and I'll
Okay.
allow folks to listen to this one too, and maybe that'll answer some. I think you answered some of the questions.
Okay.
I do get a lot of questions around pregnancy and breastfeeding and all of that, and there's a big issue right now with babies being deemed as having rickets when I don't know that they are. So I think maybe we can address that
Okay.
when we can. And I would love to continue this discussion with retinol because I do think we've left some things on the table that Morley is probably like itching to share. So,
Right.
So
And we
Steph,
can do that, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that'd be very important. Steph, I think I now know what we're going to talk about when we're together.
okay.
We're going to talk about pregnancy.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to blow your mind and your listeners' minds with what I know. And Jim, you know, if you know stuff, we can talk about that later. But I've been studying this. What I think is very funny is two old guys trying to help women with their pregnancy, but it's like the pediatricians and the obstetricians they're not
Right.
basing their decisions on fact. They're
Right.
basing on their training. I get that, but there's a difference between training and truth, and they don't know
Right.
that. So that I think would be a fun face-to-face dialogue so that I can see your eyes.
I know.
So we'll find a way to do that. And then I only have one question for Jim. Will you please send me the slides you used today?
Send you the what?
The slides that you used today?
Yeah, I sure will. I'll send them to both of you.
Okay.
I'll send them on that email we were sharing.
Okay.
And
that'd be
then
great.
anything that you think of that you want that I shared today, I said I'd share that Amy Pearl video and paper.
Yes.
Anything else you think of, I'll send as well.
I would love to spend 5 minutes in your brain. That's what I would love to do.
But yours as well. I mean, I don't know what you know.
I know. That's why these conversations are so much fun. It's just, but what I love, Steph, was it was just a very relaxed pace. I just felt
enjoyed
really,
it. It was really good.
I felt calm throughout. So thank you for allowing that to unfold. So I look forward to the next conversation because I think it's going to be the same, but we're going to move the focus a little bit and see what else is going on. I think
Well, you know, a great mentor taught me that when you're stressed, you lose magnesium. So I try to keep this really low key and
yeah, I wonder who that was.
Yeah. All right. Great conversation.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.